Hello, everyone. You are listening to Neighbor Science, the only podcast about political economy and anime, and also, as far as I know, the only capitalist power podcast. But anyway, this is going to be a supplemental episode of the Seeing Like a State book series. I don't have a guest today, and I'm only covering the intro to part 3, which I thought was its own chapter because it has so much interesting information in it. And also a supplemental study that I found. It was one of the sources that Scott cited, and it's from a book on Marxist criminology, which I am planning so far to go back to because it seems really interesting. But the specific article was actually originally printed in Radical History Review from 1982, and it's called Hunting, Fishing, and Foraging, Common Rights and Class Relations in the Postbellum South. So those are the two things I'm going to cover. I'm going to start with the part 3 intro and get that out of the way, and this paper will be, I think, the majority of this episode. Although now that I'm looking at it, it's not as long as I thought, but we'll see. I think it'll be good. So, we just got finished with Chapter 5, which was about Lenin and his high modernist ideology, and how it was criticized by Rosa Luxemburg and Alexandra Kollontai. And so Part 3 is going to go a little bit further on the authoritarian high modernist stuff. Chapter 6 is about Soviet collectivization, so the collectivization of farms in the Soviet Union in the 30s. And Chapter 7 is going to be about forced villagization or forced resettlement in Tanzania. So I haven't gotten to that chapter yet. I've already read Chapter 6, and I've got that ready to go. We're going to be recording that soon. But I didn't want to go 2 weeks without doing an episode, and I thought these two items were very interesting and worth talking about. So, again, part 3, it's just the intro section. It focuses on describing the forms of statelessness that existed prior to the modern era. In Southeast Asia, there was widespread frontier, as Scott puts it, as in untamed land, which meant that if a ruler started getting out of hand, people could easily flee from the ruler and, as Scott puts it, literally vote with their feet. Scott mentions that in these countries like Vietnam and Thailand and Cambodia, I think are the ones he mentions, the rulers there tried various methods of forcing, the populations into permanent subjugation. So he mentions that in Thailand, the rulers came up with the solution of actually tattooing their subjects or serfs as if they were property, so they could see who they belonged to. And they would send bounty hunters through the forest regularly to round up the people with that certain tattoo, which is pretty wild. He also describes, he calls it Burma, but I think it's called Myanmar now, although I'm not sure because apparently the naming is politically contentious and the people who named it are not seen as legitimate rulers by a lot of people. And I think the people that recognize that name are America. So, but as I understand it, Burma also was the colonial name. So I don't know which one to use. I'll just use Myanmar, I guess, because that's the one I remember better. So it'll just come out. But anyway, in Myanmar, the form of society that people lived in was sort of determined by its elevation. So, in the lowlands of Myanmar, there were flooded rice paddies, pretty common in Southeast Asia. And those rice paddies were part of the state because, you know, working on a rice paddy is a sedentary lifestyle. Rice is a grain, so it's very easy to confiscate it as, you know, a state's soldier. You can come up and just take it when it's harvest time, and the harvest time is pretty predictable. And it's, you know, easy to control sedentary populations. So as you go further up in elevation, people were practicing more like shifting cultivation, which for those who don't know is like the more ancient form of agriculture. One of the main types is slash and burn. Most people have heard of that. But it's basically temporary agriculture. So you know, plant some crops and then you harvest those and then you move on to somewhere else. So it's somewhat compatible with a nomadic lifestyle. And so the people that were at that elevation were, you know, less what the state would call civilized. And then if you go further up, the people are even less so. He didn't really, I don't think he gave any specifics on what sort of food system the people high up in the mountains used. I would imagine probably hunting or pastoralism, but I don't know. That's just a guess. So even like right next to the capital city, if the capital had a mountain next to it, there would be stateless people there. They would just be high up in the mountains because it's really hard for soldiers to, you know, control people that are up in the mountains. And I think that's still like somewhat the case in a lot of places. It's probably harder now with modern lifestyles and, you know, modern surveillance tools. But I think if you wanted to escape the state, your best choice would probably be the mountains. They can't be, I mean, they can be destroyed. They have been destroyed in like West Virginia, but you know, not completely, obviously, and it's not like a marsh where the marsh can be drained, and, you know, most marshes have been drained, in fact. So, like, yeah, mountains or desert, probably the two best places if you want to escape the state that you could go. So, Scott elucidates the characteristics that are shared by non-state spaces. So I'm just going to read directly here. Of course, the ecology of different elevations is only one among many factors that might characterize non-state spaces. They also appear to share one or more of the following distinctive features. They are relatively impenetrable, in parentheses, wild, trackless, labyrinthine, inhospitable. Their population is dispersed or migratory, and they are unpromising sites for surplus appropriation. Thus, marshes and swamps, in parentheses, one thinks of the now beleaguered marsh Arabs on the Iraqi-Iranian border. So, again, this book was written in 1998, so this was actually after the marshes of Iraq had been drained. And that was in retaliation for a Shia uprising after I think it said after the first Gulf War, against Saddam Hussein, obviously. So back to the passage. Thus, marshes and swamps, ever-shifting deltas and estuaries, mountains, deserts, in parentheses, favored by nomadic Berbers and Bedouins, and the sea, in parentheses, home to the so-called sea gypsies of southern Burma. And more generally, the frontier have all served as non-state spaces in the sense that I've been using the term. So one of the first episodes that me and Chris did was actually about what's called a thalassocracy, which is a type of society of seaborne people. And we talked about the Phoenicians, who had a society that lasted over 2,000 years. And they had a couple cities, but they spent most of their time on ships traveling around the Mediterranean. And they basically dominated the Mediterranean through trade. But anyway, back to... Oh, and that is episode 303. So if you're interested, check that out. But back to seeing like a state. So... he says the frontier has served as non-state spaces in the sense that I've been using the term. So he continues, he talks about the Moretus people of Kalimantan, which is the Indonesian portion of Borneo, one of the islands in the Indonesian island chain, which is also shared with East Malaysia and Brunei. Brunei is completely located on Borneo. Malaysia is partly located on Borneo and partly, I think, on the continent. So, yeah, Moretus people, nomads from Kalimantan, and they have long plagued the attempts at statecraft there. So, in an attempt to make them more legible to the Indonesian state, the state built villages for them, which were like very, like planned sort of villages, you know, very straight lines and clustered houses and everything. And they attempted to force the Moretus people into sedentism. They, of course, did not do that. But they have been instructed to look good for the government officials if they ever came by. So, people wanted them to at least pretend like they were living in houses. I don't think he ever clarified whether they did that or not. But he does clarify that the point is basically that since they live partly along these main roads through Kalimantan, they want those roads to be as controlled as possible. Scott then connects this behavior to more extreme versions of it. First, the forced resettlement of villagers in Malaya, which is a British colony, who were perceived as helping Chinese guerrilla movements. They were like rubber tapping nomads, and they were forced into villages with straight roads and numbered houses. And then also, I think he says that inspired this later project, but the strategic hamlet project that I talked about in the episode on chapter 3. So yeah, militaries would basically force them to live in villages that had straight rows of identical houses and could be easily patrolled and monitored by soldiers to ensure that they weren't providing material or intelligence to rebels. Still more extreme than the forced settlement is the fort, and the logical conclusion of that is the concentration camp, where the population is confined to a small space and completely controlled. So Scott says this resolves the apparent paradox between the productivity of smallhold versus plantations, as in the ability to produce a good, not the economic definition of productivity, and the preference of states for large plantations. So what that means is smallhold farms are actually more productive, as in able to produce more stuff per unit of land, but the state favors large plantations despite being a lot less productive. The reason they are preferred is because they allow similar advantages to the forced settlement or concentration camp, that is the ability to manage, surveil, and prevent workers from supporting rebellions. They're also more taxable. I don't know if I'm getting to this in my notes later, but yeah, they're easier to tax because rather than being a bunch of disparate small units, each with a separate group of people in charge of them, it's just one big hierarchy, making, you know, a collective amount of revenue. Scott points out in the footnotes that the belief in the efficiency of large plantations may have been based on the production of sugarcane, which actually does have some efficiency gains from centralization. And that's specifically because sugarcane needs to be crushed immediately to prevent the juice from evaporating or fermenting, and thus resulting in losses of product. So large plantations with on-site mills that can process the cane are more advantageous for that. And on top of that, processing compacts the product from its wooden form to a liquid form, which results in further efficiency gains from storage and transportation. So back to the main text, Scott uses the example of Malayan rubber production. So the colonial British governors expected the larger plantations to be more efficient, but they quickly found out that they were not. However, they continued to favor the large plantations, not only by buying from them at a higher cost for their product, but even by limiting exports from smallhold plantations during a glut caused by the end of World War I. So one of the biggest sources of demand for rubber, obviously, is militaries, mechanized militaries. So when World War I ended, there was a lot of rubber left over that wasn't going to be used for tanks and guns and stuff like that, which caused, you know, loss in the power of the sellers of the rubber. It was a buyer's market after that. So the British came up with this plan called the Stevenson Plan, which basically limited exports from those smallhold farms in order to attempt to get the price back up. But it did not work. What actually happened was the British lost control of the global rubber market. It was mainly ceded to the Dutch, who had rubber plantations elsewhere. And the Soviets also put resources into producing synthetic rubber, so they turned alcohol, I think from potatoes, into polybutadiene, which is still a used form of synthetic rubber. It's one of the most common synthetic rubbers in use. Some speculate that the protection of the large estate farms in Malaya may have been a nationalistic move to protect British-owned plantations. However, the favoring of large estates continued after the country won its independence. So even though those smallhold farms were also Malaysian, once the state had won its independence, they still favored the large plantations. So if it was a nationalistic move, it would make no sense for the state to continue doing that after they won independence. As I mentioned earlier, another advantage of the large estates is that they're much easier to assess and collect taxes from because of monocropping, legible land holdings, and centralized organization. So I left out monocropping earlier. It's easier to assess the tax liability if you have a large plantation that just grows one thing, as opposed to a smallhold farm which tends to grow more diverse sets of crops. Malaysia also had a frontier expansion in the 20th century, and part of that project included state assistance to settle land. So Scott says he met Malaysians in Kedah who told him it was fairly common knowledge that in order to be chosen to settle a frontier, you had to have a recommendation from a local politician, which implies that you had to have, like, good politics, according to them. And Scott compares these frontier settlements to company towns. So I'm going to read the passage here. The administrative and economic situation of the Malaysian settlers was comparable to that of the company towns of early industrialization, where everyone worked at comparable jobs, were paid by the same boss, lived in company housing, and shopped at the same company store. Until the plantation crops were mature, the settlers were paid a wage. Their production was marketed through state channels, and they could be dismissed for any one of a large number of infractions against the rules established by the scheme's officials. The economic dependency and direct political control meant that such schemes could regularly be made to produce large electoral majorities for the ruling party. Collective protest was rare and could usually be snuffed out by the sanctions available to the administrators. It goes without saying that the settlements of the Federal Land Development Authority allowed the state to control the mix of export crops, to monitor production and processing, and to set producer prices in order to generate revenue. And I highlighted that part about the economic dependency being made to produce large electoral majorities. I thought that was especially interesting. So Scott points out in the footnotes for this section that Malaysian plantations had difficulty recruiting laborers from the local population. There was little reason for a Malaysian to work on a large estate, likely in brutal conditions for less income, if I had to guess, when they could instead be a smallhold farmer and work for themselves. So the British colonizers ended up importing cheap labor from China and India, much like it did in the post-emancipation American colonies, where it was the same situation. The slaves weren't forced to work on plantations anymore, and they were able to get like small plots of land, and so there had to be I think this is a slur, but you know, that's the term that's used. The coolies were brought in from China and India, and so a lot of those Caribbean islands have large Indian populations because of the post-revolution plantation economy. So another footnote points out, related to the creation of electoral blocks from company towns and state settlements, that there was a similar outcome from the U.S. bombing and defoliating of the forest in Vietnam. The fleeing refugees who were grouped into camps, refugee camps, were more easily manipulated in electoral strategies. And this wasn't just like incidental, it was an intentional effect that the architects of the war were well aware of. It also has analogous instances in history, such as the proletarianization of the peasantry and the resulting radical politics of the declining rural population. So that's the end of the intro to part 3. Pretty short, but also, I think, a wealth of information. So now I will start on this article that was cited. It was cited in part 3, but I didn't mention it in those notes because I'm going to talk about it at length here. This other source is called Hunting, Fishing, and Foraging, Common Rights and Class Relations in the Postbellum South. It's by Steve Hahn, who is a Marxist historian, and it's reprinted from Radical History Review 26, which is from 1982. And I got this from a book called Crime and Capitalism, Readings in Marxist Criminology. So, Hahn sets the stage for this study with a specific historical event. He says, when the Beach Island Farmers Club, a planter organization in Aiken, South Carolina, met in January 1875, it passed resolutions instructing members to, quote, prosecute all trespassers and violators of the game laws, prevent, quote, tenants and laborers from keeping, quote, stock of any kind on any enclosed or unenclosed land not specifically allotted to them, and that livestock, quote, trespassing beyond allotted land be impounded for the first offense and forfeited or destroyed for the second. So they further directed that all members of the wider community should do so as well. And this was basically an attempt at a sort of revanchist project. So it was part of this whole movement. After the loss of the Civil War and the abolition of U.S. chattel slavery, former plantation owners had obviously lost their source of free labor, and they aimed to recapture it somehow. Since former slaves were able to live off the land by fishing, trapping, hunting, foraging, and grazing, they were not only no longer the property of plantation owners, but didn't have to work for them for pay either, because they could subsist on their own. The enforcement of trespassing and poaching laws and the enclosure of the commons was an established pattern for destroying non-state ways of living and proletarianizing people, and that was pioneered, obviously, in post-medieval Europe. Hahn notes that most land in the antebellum South was fee simple. This is the type of land ownership that we're most familiar with. Older countries had land ownership laws that were tied to the medieval period, such as primogeniture, where land is inherited by the firstborn son, and fee tail, where restrictions were put on the sale of land and it would be passed down based on provisions in a will, usually to a single male heir. But it couldn't be sold. However, it was customary for unimproved land, even if it were de jure owned, to be treated as commons in the South, both pre and post-bellum. Hahn quotes a wealthy South Carolina planter, William Eliot, from 1859. Though it is the broad common law maxim that everything upon a man's land is his own, and he can shut it out from his neighbor without any wrong to him, yet custom with us, forfeited by certain decisions in the court, has gone far to qualify and set limits to the maxim. So, public opinion at the time was broadly in favor of these commons. People saw it as their right to hunt wild animals, which Hahn supports with a court transcript. So a prosecutor says, "Would you pursue a deer if he entered your neighbor's enclosure?" And a hunter says, "Certainly." The prosecutor responds, "What if his fields were planted and his cotton growing or his grain ripe?" "It would make no difference. I should follow my dogs where they might." And the judge says, "And pull down your neighbor's fence and trample on his fields?" The hunter says, "I should do it, though I might regret to injure him." The judge says, "You would commit a trespass. You would be mulcted in damages. There is no law for such an act." And the hunter says, "It is hunter's law, however." Hunting, besides being a way of life, was also a fancy sport for rich plantation owners, though. So, naturally, they projected their ecologically destructive tendencies onto others and feared that peasant hunters would deplete the supply of game and thereby threaten one of their favorite sports. The poor sport. The wealthy began to exert pressure for game laws in the mid-19th century and had partial successes in Maryland and Virginia. Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia also started hunting seasons for deer, turkey, partridge, and quail. Unfortunately for the wealthy, the game laws in England were widely viewed as tyrannical, and so that the popular resistance to those laws carried over to the American situation, which limited the actual force of the game laws. Eliot, the planter, noted that the preservation of game is thus associated with the ideas of aristocracy, peculiar privileges to the rich, and oppression toward the poor. It was also common at the time for cattle, hogs, and sheep to be grazed on common land. Talking of how grazing animals were fed simply by turning them loose in the woods, one resident of South Carolina said, "We raise our hogs by allowing them to range in our woods, where they get fat in the autumn on acorns." They also explained we really raise cattle with so little care that it would be a shame to charge anything for their keep up to 3 years. So they literally just like let them loose in the woods to eat whatever they want. Prior to the global dominance of capitalism, this was a common practice in Europe and Africa and made its way to the Americas as well. A law passed in 1759 in Georgia specified precise guidelines for farmers to enclose their crops to allow grazing on uncultivated land. Poorer whites, who, to be clear, were still landowners, were committed to common rights, to be clear, for one another, and did not view individual enterprise as a practical way to achieve independence. Social relations of the antebellum yeoman were primarily mediated by kinship and mutual obligation rather than trucking or bartering, like, what's-his-fuck said, Adam Smith, that guy. The plantation owners had to confront the labor question, as they called it, after the abolition of slavery. Where previously they had a source of free labor from which their fortunes came, now the status of not only their wealth but the power of the state in the South was in critical danger. The upper class's arguments for proletarianization of Euro-American non-state people were echoed in Reconstruction. To quote directly, the old masters confronted the issue of the labor question with little optimism. Experience had demonstrated, they believed, that black people were inherently lazy, indolent, and unreliable and would never submit voluntarily to the demands of a plantation regime. Quote, as a general rule, the world over, in freedom or in bondage, the Southern cultivator declared, labor can be extracted from the Negro only by compulsion. Freedmen tried many new ways of life after emancipation. To quote, they roamed the countryside, made their way to cities and towns, squatted on unenclosed land. Reluctant to sign contracts and return to regimented fieldwork, they looked to and felt they had a right to set up for themselves. One freedman explained, all I want is to get 4 or 5 acres of land that I can build me a little house on and call my home. And I fixed that specific quote a little bit because it was transcribed in a very offensive way. So, the labor question therefore led naturally to the land question, whether or not the federal government would expropriate the plantation owners and distribute it to the freedmen. While obviously that didn't happen, the available commons meant that there wasn't an endless supply of cheap, obedient workers. And as an aside here, I just wanted to point out that I think the long-term solution to this has been the U.S. immigration system, which in combination with its foreign policy creates a continuous flow of immigrants, many destitute or refugees, to fill the need for cheap labor. We have essentially 2 tiers of immigration. One, those who are wealthy and educated have one system of immigration that involves visa sponsorship, being educated in American English and American civics, which costs money to acquire and is subject to approval by bureaucrats. They are called naturalized, and in many ways, they're still second-class citizens. And 2, those who are destitute or non-Anglophone and aren't sponsored by a U.S. corporation do not get approved by bureaucrats, come without a visa, or don't leave when their visa expires. They are called illegal, and depending on your interpretation of the first category, are second or third class citizens. These laborers fill the bulk of jobs that were left vacant by emancipation, so they're the ones that are currently working on the large plantation-like farms. The main differences between this system and the chattel slavery system are that today field workers aren't chattel, they aren't subject to the same level of worksite brutality, but they are at risk of being put in a concentration camp or deported. So, not quite the same as chattel slavery, but not really free either. So back to the article. In the Caribbean, freedmen were able to subsist on the marginal land that was allotted to them, which is called provision ground, and uninhabited land. This caused the postbellum plantation owners to fear a similar outcome in the South, leaving plantation owners unable to produce cotton. Alabama's Clark County Journal warned that freedmen will raise their corn, squashes, pigs, and chickens, and will work no more in the cotton, rice, and sugar fields. Aw, poor plantation owners. Soon the southern states would enact laws against vagrancy and rental of land to freedmen, as well as pushing for stricter property rights. And I don't know about the latter, but the laws against vagrancy definitely are from the European experiment in proletarianization. In only a matter of years, many states had passed trespass laws imposing fines on anyone who enters enclosed or unenclosed land for timber, fodder, or forage without the owner's permission. That, again, comes from the European proletarianization. Georgia had an even stricter law against squatting or setting upon enclosed or unenclosed land of another, whether public or private, without bona fide claim, title, or consent. And again, this comes from, precedent in forced settlement of nomads in Europe. The push for game and stock laws returned during this period. The labor question, the cost of fencing cultivated land. Did I mention that earlier? I don't even know. Just to make sure that I mentioned it, there were laws that forced planters to put fences around the cultivated land, so that the uncultivated land could be commons, and if they didn't, then they were liable for any damages or whatever. So the labor question, the cost of fencing cultivated land, and the cynical conservationist arguments helped to sell game and stock laws to the public. The tragedy of the commons argument, first described in 1833 to justify closing the English and Irish commons, was deployed in the postbellum South for the same reasons. And I will note the tragedy of the commons probably more well known for the Garrett Hardin essay, which is, as I put it in a tweet, a pro-eugenics and pro-enclosure screed written by an open white nationalist, which is true. He is an open white nationalist. So there was still widespread resistance to the game and stock laws, even from poor white settlers who, while they saw freedmen as their enemies, found themselves in agreement with them on property laws. To quote, "We have a class of farmers and stock owners among us who are opposed to any innovation on the practice of their fathers, from the use of the subsoil plow to the enactment of a no-fence stock law." I think that might have been William Elliot, the plantation owner. I didn't write down who it actually was. Even in the South during slavery, black slaves had a reputation as exceptional fishermen and trappers, and had free rein to do so, as well as control of most of the good fishing spots. So, I think I wrote this down later on, but I'll just say it now. There were broadly two systems of slavery in the antebellum South. One was called the task system, and one was called the gang system. So the gang system was by far the more brutal version, where you would bring a whole gaggle of slaves to the work site, and you would basically just force them to work until the master was satisfied. They would all have to work at the same time. The task system was not quite as brutal, and that is where the slaves would get a specific task for the day, and once they were done with it, they would have free time to do what they wanted to. And so a lot of the slaves in the task system spent their free time fishing and trapping animals. And so they were actually able to find all these good fishing spots, and they sort of had a little monopoly on them. Many slaves were also adept at grazing and were able to keep animals even while living on plantations. So again, they would have been under the task system, most likely. So after emancipation, enough of the freedmen were dependent on grazing animals that one was quoted by Edward King as saying, "I tell you one thing, this here no-fence law was one of the lowest things I ever did." Planters wanted legislation to specify damages for violation of stock and game laws because they feared that if left up to the courts to decide, it would essentially cause the laws to not be enforced. And if I remember right, the article actually cites like some reasoning for that. There were basically violations of the fence laws where, even though the law was stricter on the violator, the court sided with them anyway because it was basically common law. While black men were able to win political office as Republicans for a short time during Reconstruction and hold off game and stock laws, it wasn't long before the white reactionaries had retaken control of the government. The ideal situation for the plantation owners was essentially feudalism, because they felt it was, quote, beneath their dignity to bid for the labor of ex-slaves. The planters would have had the freedmen be dependents of the planters, so that they could be kept around all the time and forced to work for subsistence. Freedmen who did wage labor used the free labor system somewhat to their advantage, avoiding gang labor. There's a whole parenthetical explaining it, which I already did. So that they avoided gang labor, and I think I meant to finish that sentence, but I never did. Basically, if there were any unfavorable employment situations on the farms where they were working for pay, they would just move on elsewhere, and they sort of worked together to avoid the same places. A further important gain made by plantation owners in their Revanchist project came in the form of the lien law. Many southern states passed laws that allowed agricultural suppliers to place liens on the crops grown with their supplies. Thus, the major landholders could go into the supply business, provide the necessary supplies for agriculture, and take ownership of the produce without having to pay for labor. I don't have specific evidence of this, but the McCormick family, who were definitely plantation owners, created one of the largest agricultural equipment manufacturing companies in history, which... let me look that up real quick. Yeah, it was called the International Harvester Company. It's now defunct. I think it went out of business, 1985. So only 3 years after this was written, interestingly. But yeah, so he created one of the largest agricultural equipment manufacturing companies in history, and he definitely extended credit to customers in order to sell the equipment. So it's very likely that the McCormick family took advantage of the lien laws. According to Hahn, purchasing goods on credit, the norm, required farmers to mortgage their crops as security, and storekeepers made plain their preference for cotton. So the need to get this agricultural equipment and the high cost of the equipment, which, if it behaves anything like other products where people mainly get it through credit, the price is way above what it needs to be based on the cost. There's just very high margins. So they raise the prices of these equipment, and say like, yeah, you can pay in kind, and we prefer cotton. So it's basically forcing people back into growing cotton. So in the 1880s, stock laws were again being pushed by the wealthy, with various arguments in its favor. So to quote directly, open-range foraging, they submitted, was sad evidence of old fogeyism, general ignorance, and backwardness of agriculture, contributing to timber scarcity, inefficiency, and the proliferation of useless, scrubby stock. It was a custom dignified by no more than peculiar circumstances and a hard-headedness, a sap on economic progress and prosperity, and a violation of natural rights. Indeed, many supporters of fencing reform viewed common grazing as a privilege or favor bordering upon theft. My neighbor has as much right to pasture in my enclosed land as my unenclosed, one of them put it, as his stock robs it of its vegetable matter, making it poorer every day. Which, as I understand it, is not really true. If you graze land, it generally helps the soil, because ruminants are generally good for the soil. But that wouldn't get in the way of their argument, so... Opponents of the stock laws argued that the basis of liberty, rights, and equality was reciprocity and commonwealth, saying, "The woods were put here by our Creator for a benefit to his people," that proponents were men who ever split but few, if any, rails, and that while my cow is on his neighbor's land eating grass, his is mine, and that makes it all right. Despite proponents of stock laws attempting to disenfranchise voters and commit election fraud, stock laws were repeatedly crushed through the 1880s. They shifted their strategy to work at the county level, and it was 65 years before a statewide stock law was passed. So, obviously today, there's not much in the way of commons in the U.S., but as Han makes the case for, it was actually very common in the Antebellum South to use common lands, which I thought was very interesting. Nothing that I would ever expect. Something else that I thought was pretty interesting about this was the Bundy Ranch standoff from, I think it was 2014. If you don't remember that, it was some ranchers in Nevada who were court-ordered to pay over $1 million in grazing fees by the U.S. Bureau of Land Management. And they basically refused and ended up in an armed standoff with the police and possibly the FBI. I don't remember exactly. But it's kind of funny that they would have been essentially on the same side as the freedmen for, attempted extortion of grazing fees for just grazing cattle. And these guys also, this could be a totally cynical thing like the Boogaloo Boys, but they also famously came out in favor of Black Lives Matter last year. And their fans were distraught, of course, because they're all racist assholes. But it's funny, they're definitely some of the more interesting characters in U.S. politics. So yeah, I don't think I have a whole lot else on that. I actually expected the article to go for longer, but I guess I wrote it up so well that I could just keep going. So I will just say that next week will be Chapter 6 of Seeing Like a State on Soviet collectivization. So look forward to that. I think that will be a pretty long one. It might end up being 2 parts depending on how long we go. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our other episodes on every podcast platform, including Spotify and YouTube. We would love it if you left a nice review on iTunes, which helps people get the show in their recommendations, or tell your friends if you're cool enough to have those. We have a low-key merch shop at Teespring with some cool shirt designs. I know it's not really good to use them, but until there's significant interest in merch, it would be pretty impractical to do a run of merch from a proper printer, so if people are interested, let us know. You can follow us on Twitter at NeighborSciPod. If you want to support the show and help pay our producer, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/neighborscience. And our producer for some of our episodes is Casino Socks. You can check out his music at soundcloud.com/casinosocks. And finally, you can check out our website, neighborsciencepodcast.com, which has tags on all our episodes. So if you're looking for a particular subject, it's much easier to find on there than just scrolling through the entire list of episodes in your podcast app. And thanks again for listening.